Imagine the unthinkable. He murdered his wife for her fortune, then tried to frame his 9-year-old daughter for the crime. What happens when the lies start to unravel? Stay with us as we reveal the shocking twists and dark truths behind Rod Covlin's downfall. Will he get away with it? Or will justice catch up to him in the most unexpected way? Watch until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. This hook creates suspense, intrigues the viewer, and encourages them to stay engaged for the entire video. Rod Covlin stared at the lifeless body of his wife, Sheila. The coldness of the room seemed to seep into his bones. She was gone. Her blood, once vibrant, now stained the expensive rug beneath her. He could still smell the sharp tang of it, mixing with the musty air. He had done it. She was dead. And soon, her fortune would be his. The plan was simple. But as he looked at her, something gnawed at his stomach. The silence in the room felt oppressive. He could hear the soft ticking of the clock, the sound too loud now, as if mocking him. Rod swallowed hard. His mind raced, calculating his next move. But there was something else, something that tightened his chest. A sound. A tiny voice from the hallway. "Dad? Mom?" His daughter, Katie, was coming down the stairs. Her small feet pattered across the floor. Rod froze. The door creaked open, and there she stood, her innocent face peering in. Katie's eyes widened as she saw her mother on the ground. "Daddy, what's wrong with Mom?" Rod felt a lump in his throat. He forced a smile, his heart pounding in his chest. "She's resting," he muttered, but the words felt wrong, even to him. Katie didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stared. Rod's mind scrambled. He couldn't let her see. He couldn't let her be the one who knew. His hands trembled. His mind twisted with new ideas. What if she was the one who found her? What if she was the one who got blamed? The thought felt almost too sweet to deny. Katie could be the perfect scapegoat. He looked at her. So small. So innocent. She wouldn't know what hit her. Katie had always been too trusting, too pure. Rod clenched his jaw. The pieces were falling into place. The will was clear. Sheila's fortune. It would be his. The police would never suspect a thing. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Katie had no idea what was coming. But soon she would. Rod stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Katie stood frozen, still staring at her mother's body. Her wide eyes were filled with confusion, but no fear. It was as if she didn't fully understand what she was seeing. Rod reached out, gently taking her small hand in his. His fingers were cold against her warm skin. "Katie," he whispered, his voice too soft, too smooth. "We need to get some help."
She didn't resist.
Her tiny hand clutched his, trusting him completely. Rod led her away from the scene, but his mind raced. A plan was forming. He needed to make it look like she had done it. The child.
Katie.
She had always been so quiet, so obedient. It was perfect. Rod could already see it in his mind, how it would unfold. The authorities would believe it. They would see her confusion, her fear. The tragedy of a little girl who had snapped. The thought made his stomach churn, but he suppressed it. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think this through. Rod locked the door behind him. His eyes flickered back to Katie, who was now sitting on the couch, her legs crossed, her small face tilted in thought. "Everything will be okay," he said, though he knew that was a lie. Katie looked up at him, the sadness in her eyes too much for someone so young. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered. Rod's heart squeezed. He had to keep it together. He couldn't let her see how the walls were closing in on him. "Don't worry," he replied, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. The phone was next. Rod picked it up, dialing 911, his fingers trembling as he pressed the numbers. His voice was shaky as he spoke to the dispatcher, explaining that his wife was dead. It looks like she fell," he lied. "I found her like this." His voice cracked with the weight of the words. But in his mind, he could already hear the sirens in the distance. The police would come. They would investigate. And Katie would be the one they looked at. Rod hung up the phone, the dispatcher's voice still echoing in his mind. He could already hear the sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. His pulse quickened. The plan was in motion, but his hands shook as he paced the room. Katie sat quietly, her small fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. Rod glanced at her, then back at the door. The sirens were closer now. He could already hear the heavy footsteps of officers on the stairs. His stomach tightened. This was it. Everything depended on how well he executed his next move. He needed to act fast. The doorbell rang. Rod's breath hitched. The officers were here. Katie was still staring at her hands. Rod rushed to the door, his movement sharp, too deliberate. He opened it wide, forcing a grin, even though his insides were screaming. Two officers stood on the porch, their faces grim. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where is she?" one of them asked, his eyes scanning the room. Rod nodded toward the living room, his voice tight. "She's in there. I don't know what happened. I found her like this." The officers exchanged glances as they stepped inside. Katie didn't speak, her silence almost unnerving. Rod led them to the body, but the moment they saw Sheila lying there, the tension in the room shifted. The officers crouched down to inspect the scene, their movements precise. Rod watched them closely, his heart thumping in his chest. They murmured to each other in hushed tones. Rod could feel the sweat prickling his skin, but he kept his face neutral. One of the officers stood up, his expression hardening. "Sir, can you tell me exactly what happened here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Rod swallowed. He hesitated. "I came downstairs and I found her. She was on the floor. I thought she had fallen." The officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp as he studied Rod's face. "Fallen?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "How?" Rod froze, panic rising in his chest. The officer's tone was too sharp, too probing. "I don't know. Maybe she tripped," Rod muttered, forcing his voice to remain calm. But the words felt wrong, even to him. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved closer to Sheila's body, his fingers tracing something. Rod's breath caught in his throat. The officer lifted something from the ground. A small, glistening object. A piece of jewelry. Rod's mind raced, but his face remained unreadable. The officer turned to him. "It looks like your wife was strangled." The room seemed to close in on him. His heart pounded in his ears. The officer's eyes locked onto his. Rod's blood ran cold. The walls were closing in. Rod's chest tightened as he stared at the officer, his mind reeling. Strangled. The word echoed in his ears. He could feel his pulse racing, the blood in his veins thumping like a drumbeat. His mind scrambled for words, but they wouldn't come. The officer's eyes were fixed on him now, too knowing, too sharp. Rod's throat was dry. I didn't know," he whispered, trying to force the words out, but they sounded hollow, weak. The officer's expression didn't change. He stepped closer to Sheila's body, examining the bruises around her neck. Rod's thoughts were in a frenzy. He had planned for everything. But this wasn't part of the plan. The strangulation, it was too precise. Too personal. Rod's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Sir, can you explain the situation more clearly?" the officer asked again, his voice colder now, more demanding. Rod opened his mouth, but no sound came.
He forced himself to speak.
I came downstairs and I saw her lying there. She must have been attacked. Someone must have broken in." The officer raised an eyebrow. "A break-in? And nothing was taken?" he asked, clearly skeptical. Rod's throat went dry, but he pushed forward. "I didn't see anything missing. Maybe they just killed her and ran." The officer didn't respond immediately. He looked at Rod with an intensity that made his skin crawl. But just as the silence threatened to overwhelm him, another officer walked into the room. "I think you should come with us," the officer said. Rod froze. His heart stopped for a second. His blood turned to ice. He felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. He tried to steady his breathing, but it came out in shallow gasps. Katie's voice interrupted his thoughts.
"Daddy."
She stood in the hallway, her eyes wide with confusion. The moment her gaze shifted to the officers, her expression changed. Fear spread across her face. Rod's stomach churned. He couldn't let this happen. Not to her.
"Not now."
"Katie, it's okay," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But as the officers turned their attention to Katie, he saw something in their eyes. They were noticing things. Small details that didn't quite add up. Rod felt the panic building again, but he did his best to hide it. The officer from before spoke, his voice cold, sharp. "Sir, we're going to need to ask you some more questions." Rod nodded, unable to form words. He knew something was wrong. Something was slipping out of his control. The trap was slowly tightening around him. He had killed Sheila for her money. But now it seemed that no amount of fortune could buy him freedom. And worse, he could see it in the officer's eyes. Katie wasn't innocent in this, not anymore. Not if they believed the story Rod had just told. But the question burned in his mind. Would they believe him? Or would they see through his lies? Rod could feel the weight of their gaze on him. Every word, every movement now seemed to betray him. The officers were too quiet, too observant. His mind raced, but his body felt frozen. Katie's small voice broke the stillness, once again. "Are they taking you away, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide and filled with fear. Rod's heart clenched. He wanted to protect her, shield her from the truth. But in that moment, everything felt like it was slipping out of his grasp. One of the officers nodded. "We just need to ask your father a few more questions," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. Katie looked at him, confused, still not fully understanding what was happening. Rod swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to get control of this situation. The plan was still in motion, but now it was starting to unravel. His mind shot to the lie he had told.
Could they see through it?
Could they tell it was just a story he had spun to cover up the truth? The officer who had found the bruises on Sheila's neck was still staring at him. Rod could feel his eyes piercing through him. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Rod couldn't take it anymore. He needed to act. His eyes flickered to the door. Could he make a run for it?
No.
That would only make him look guilty. Rod clenched his fists. The officers were moving closer now. "Mr. Covlin," one of them said, his voice cutting through the tension, "we're going to need to ask you to come down to the station." Rod's heart slammed in his chest. "Is that necessary?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We just need your statement, Mr. Covlin," the officer replied, his tone soft but insistent. Rod didn't argue. He couldn't. The walls were closing in, tighter and tighter, and his mind screamed for a way out. But it was too late. As they moved toward him, leading him out of the house, his eyes caught Katie's one last time. Her small face was pale, her lips trembling. She didn't understand. And that, Rod realized, was the hardest part. He had killed for the fortune. But now, with everything spiraling out of control, it was clear he had lost something much more valuable.
Katie.
He had sacrificed her innocence too. And there was no way to take it back. As the officers led him toward the door, Rod could feel the weight of his daughter's gaze burning into his back. Each step away from her felt like a deeper cut, something that could never be undone. The air outside was cold, biting, but Rod barely felt it. His mind was consumed by the thought of Katie, standing in that house, confused and scared. He glanced back, but the door slammed shut behind him before he could see her face again. The officers guided him to the squad car, their presence a constant reminder that the walls were closing in. Rod tried to gather his thoughts, but everything felt muddled. The lie he'd built, The carefully woven story felt flimsy now, like it could fall apart with the slightest touch. As they reached the car, he was shoved into the back seat, the door clicking shut behind him with a hollow sound. The engine started, and the car rumbled to life, pulling away from the house. Rod's fingers gripped the seat, his nails digging into the fabric as if holding onto something solid could anchor him in this nightmare. The silence in the car was suffocating. The officers sat in the front, talking quietly among themselves, but Rod couldn't hear their words. His mind was too loud. Was the investigation already turning in another direction? Did they already suspect him? Could they see through his carefully constructed facade? Every detail of the night before, the moment he had planned Sheila's death, the careful timing, the lies, was starting to unravel. But there was something else now. Something he hadn't anticipated. He had thought he could manipulate the story, control the narrative. But now, as the city lights flashed by, he realized how deeply he had underestimated the situation. Rod could feel the tension rising in his chest, the panic crawling up his throat. He couldn't stop thinking about Katie. Would she be next? Would she be blamed for something she didn't understand? And why had he ever thought he could get away with it? The police car took a sharp turn, and Rod was jolted in his seat, his stomach lurching. The guilt gnawed at him, more than anything he had ever felt before. The sirens, the cold metal of the car, the officers' watchful eyes, it all blurred together in a haze of terror. It was too late to turn back now, and all he could think about was how his life, his future, was already slipping out of his grasp. But the worst part wasn't that his world was crumbling. It was that the person he had betrayed, the person he had pushed into the chaos, was still waiting for him.
Katie.
His own daughter. And she didn't deserve any of it. The car rumbled down the quiet streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Rod's thoughts swirled, each one more frantic than the last. The way Katie had looked at him, the fear in her eyes, haunted him now. He tried to shake it off. There was nothing he could do for her now. He had to focus on himself, on what was happening to him. His mind kept replaying the scene in the house, the officer's eyes, the glint of suspicion. He knew they weren't buying his story. He could feel it. But how could they know? There was no evidence. No way they could prove anything. The police would look at him, ask questions, but they wouldn't find the answers. Not yet. Not unless Katie said something. And that thought made his skin crawl. The car slowed as they approached the station. Rod's throat went dry. The truth was closing in. There was nowhere to hide anymore. They pulled up to the station, and the officers got out, opening the door for him. Rod stepped out, his legs feeling unsteady. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let them see how afraid he was. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting an unflattering glow over everything. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. The officers led him down a narrow hallway, past empty rooms filled with echoes of past investigations. Rod's heart was pounding in his chest, the beat a loud drum that drowned out everything else. He was taken into a small, bare room, the walls painted in a dull, lifeless shade of gray. The table in the center of the room was cold, hard. Rod sat down, his legs stiff, his thoughts racing. He could feel their eyes on him. The two officers, standing across from him, weren't saying anything. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke volumes. Rod's breathing grew shallow as he tried to steady himself. He had to stay composed. He couldn't let them see how terrified he was. A door opened, and another officer stepped inside, holding a file. Rod stiffened as the officer placed it on the table. The file was thick, bulging with pages that were now his undoing. The officer flipped it open, scanning the papers inside, his expression unreadable. Rod's eyes darted to the contents of the file, but he couldn't make sense of the words. Then, the officer looked up at him, his gaze piercing. "We found something," the officer said, his voice quiet but firm. Rod's stomach dropped. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Rod's heart raced. The officer leaned forward, his fingers tapping the file. "The jewelry," he said, his voice low. Rod's blood ran cold. It had been a mistake. A stupid mistake. The piece of jewelry the officer had found at the scene, the one Sheila had been wearing when she died.
It was a unique, custom design.
Rod had known it would be recognized, but he hadn't thought it would come back to him so quickly. The officer continued, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "We've traced the piece. It was bought by you." Rod's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the words crushed him. It was over. They knew. The officers didn't need to say anything else. Rod could feel the walls closing in. He had failed. Everything he had done, every lie, every careful step he had taken, was crumbling around him. Katie's innocence was slipping away, too, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Rod's heart was pounding in his chest, each beat growing louder, more desperate. The officer's words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating him. "We traced it back to you," the officer repeated, his voice colder now. "You bought the jewelry for her, didn't you?" Rod's mind raced, a blur of thoughts spinning in every direction. He tried to focus, tried to find something to say, but the words stuck in his throat. He had known this would happen. He had known they'd find out. But hearing it out loud was something else. It was like being hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. The officer slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of the jewelry, the same piece that had been found at the scene of the crime, clearly identified as something Rod had purchased. Rod stared at it, feeling the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" the officer asked, his voice sharp now, demanding answers. Rod opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind was numb. His body felt like it was sinking into the cold, unforgiving chair beneath him. There was no escape now. His lie had caught up with him. He had killed Sheila for her money, convinced himself he could get away with it, but the cracks in his story were widening. The officers were closing in, their questions more pointed, their eyes sharper than ever. Rod could feel the walls tightening around him. The sound of the door opening behind him broke the silence, and another officer stepped in, holding a new set of documents. Rod didn't need to see them to know what they were. More evidence. The pieces were all falling into place, and with every piece, Rod was sinking deeper into his own lies. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure, but it was impossible. "Katie," he muttered, almost to himself. The words slipped from his lips before he could stop it. The officers paused, their eyes flickering to each other. Rod's mind twisted. In the space of a breath, he realized the trap he had been setting for her. The little girl he had tried to frame was now a ticking bomb.
But no one cared about that now.
No one cared about his daughter. They only cared about the evidence, the truth that was unraveling before them. "I didn't mean to," Rod finally managed to say, his voice breaking. The officers didn't respond. They didn't need to. The truth was clear. Rod could feel the weight of it crushing him. Katie would be pulled into this. Whether she spoke or not, they would come for her. And as the door closed behind the officer, leaving him alone in the room with nothing but his guilt and the heavy silence, Rod realized there was no turning back. Everything was falling apart, and the world he had tried so hard to build, one based on lies, deceit, and violence, was crumbling before his eyes. There would be no fortune, no escape, just the cold truth, and the consequences of his choices. The room was suffocating now, every second stretching into an eternity. Rod's mind felt like it was shattering, breaking into 1,000 pieces. He couldn't think straight. His thoughts were a mess of guilt, fear, and dread. Every part of him wanted to scream, to somehow stop what was coming, but he couldn't. The officers had the evidence. They had the jewelry, the lies, the fractured story he had spun. They had him, and they had Katie in their sights. Rod's stomach churned at the thought of his daughter.
She was just a child.
She didn't deserve any of this. He had thought he could control everything. He had thought he could make the world bend to his will, but now everything was slipping through his fingers. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to steady his breath. The door opened again. Rod's head snapped up, his heart racing. A man in a suit stepped into the room, his face unreadable. The officers stood and moved aside, but this one felt different. He was calm.
Too calm.
"I'm Detective Harris," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an authority that made Rod's skin prickle. Rod didn't respond. He couldn't find his voice. Detective Harris didn't seem to mind. He took a seat across from Rod, his eyes never leaving him. "I've been briefed on your case," the detective continued, his tone measured, almost clinical. "But I want to hear it from you. What happened last night?" Rod swallowed, his throat dry, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. The question hung in the air, heavier than any weight he'd ever felt. Rod opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. How could he explain it? How could he possibly justify the horror he had caused? I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice cracking. Detective Harris's eyes flickered, but he didn't interrupt. Rod tried to continue, but the words came out in a jumble, tangled in his guilt. I wanted to be free. Sheila, she had money. I thought if I could get rid of her, I could have it all," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. The detective didn't flinch. Rod's confession hung in the air, the weight of it suffocating him. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And what about your daughter?" the detective asked, his voice soft but piercing. Rod's breath caught. His eyes flickered to the floor. I didn't want her to get in the way," he muttered, as if the words themselves repulsed him. A cold silence filled the room. The detective's eyes were steady, unwavering. "You tried to frame her," Harris said slowly, almost as if he were testing the weight of the accusation. Rod froze. He couldn't deny it. The evidence was there, and the truth was as clear as the blood on his hands. His breath hitched in his chest. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him. Detective Harris leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Rod's face. "We both know it doesn't matter how much money you thought you could get. It doesn't matter how carefully you planned it," he said. "What matters now is that you failed. And it's your daughter who will suffer the most because of it." Rod's throat tightened. He felt the weight of the words crushing him, the realization of just how much he had ruined. Everything he had done, every lie, every manipulation, had been in vain. Katie's face flashed before him again, her wide, innocent eyes, full of confusion and fear. Rod could barely breathe as he sank back in his chair, the guilt overwhelming him. And as the detective stood, preparing to leave the room, he turned back to Rod, his eyes hard. "You'll face the consequences of your actions, Mr. Covlin. Every single one of them." Rod remained motionless as Detective Harris left the room. The door clicked shut, but the silence was louder than anything he had ever experienced. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and regret, each thought sharper than the last. The images of Sheila's lifeless body, Katie's frightened face, and the cold, clinical interrogation he had just endured all bled together into a single, unbearable weight pressing down on him. He had thought he could escape it. He had thought he could manipulate the situation, bend it to his will, and walk away free. But now, in this small, sterile room, it was all crashing down on him. The truth was inescapable. Rod's hands shook as he placed them on the cold table, trying to steady himself, but it felt as if the world around him was slipping out of focus. His thoughts kept circling back to Katie. He had wanted so desperately to protect her from the consequences of his actions, but it seemed like she was already caught in the web he had woven. He had never imagined it would come to this, his daughter, an unwitting pawn in his twisted game. The door opened again, and Rod's heart skipped a beat. Two officers entered this time, their faces unreadable. Rod's throat tightened as they approached him, their footsteps slow and deliberate. One of the officers held a file, similar to the one before, and Rod could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The officer placed the file on the table, and Rod couldn't stop himself from glancing at it. It was all there. The evidence. The timeline. The documents that tied him to Sheila's death, and the elaborate lie he had spun to frame his daughter. Rod's gaze flickered to the officers as one of them spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We've been through your story, Mr. Covlin," the officer said, "and we've uncovered a lot of inconsistencies. Your alibi doesn't hold up. The forensic evidence doesn't match what you've told us." Rod's stomach lurched. The walls were closing in faster now, every lie he had told unraveling piece by piece. "We know you killed your wife for her money," the officer continued, his words cold and unforgiving. "We also know you tried to shift the blame to your daughter. You thought you could get away with it. But now, we have everything we need to charge you." Rod's pulse quickened, and his chest tightened painfully. His body felt heavy, as if the very air in the room was suffocating him. Katie. The thought of her caught in this, a victim of his choices, made his insides twist. He had ruined her life. Rod opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. There was nothing left to say. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the certainty in their eyes. He had failed. Everything had spiraled out of his control, and there was no escape. Rod slumped in his chair, feeling the crushing weight of his guilt and regret bear down on him. He had killed Sheila for her fortune, and in the process, he had destroyed everything that mattered, his own life, his daughter's future, and the chance for redemption he could never reach. The officers moved toward the door, but before they left, one of them turned back to Rod. "You'll be charged with murder, Mr. Covlin. And if the court sees fit, you'll face the consequences for trying to frame your daughter, too." The door slammed shut behind them, and the silence in the room became deafening. Rod's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the cold, empty walls. He was trapped. There was nowhere to hide, and no one left to deceive. He had sealed his own fate. Rod's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as he sat alone in the cold, dimly lit room. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, pressing tighter and tighter with every passing second. The weight of his actions, his lies, his betrayal, suffocated him, and the deafening silence only made it worse. He could hear the distant sounds of the station, muffled voices, footsteps echoing down the hallway. But in the small, empty room, everything felt still, frozen.
It was just him now.
His mind was numb, but the guilt, raw and suffocating, was impossible to ignore. Katie's face swirled in his mind, her innocent eyes, so full of fear and confusion. He had done this to her. He had pushed her into this nightmare, thinking he could control it, thinking he could escape the consequences of his greed. But now, as the reality set in, there was no escape, no way to undo what had been done. He thought about the fortune. He had believed that the money, the lifestyle, would solve everything. But it had only led him down a darker path, one that now had no way out. Rod closed his eyes, rubbing his temples, as if he could somehow erase the images, the memories. But they were etched into him now, each one sharper than the last. How had it come to this? How had he allowed himself to become so consumed by the desire for more, that he had sacrificed everything that truly mattered? He had killed his wife. And in doing so, he had killed his own soul. His thoughts turned to Katie again. What would happen to her now? Would they understand that she had been nothing more than a victim in all of this? Or would she become another casualty of his selfishness? He had been so focused on his own escape, on the illusion of a life he could never have, that he had failed to see the damage he was doing to the one person who truly mattered. Rod ran his hands through his hair, tugging at it in frustration. The shame was overwhelming. The guilt. It was more than he could bear. He wanted to scream, to do something, anything, to make it stop. But he knew it was too late. Everything was beyond his control now. The door creaked open, and Rod's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat. It was Detective Harris again. Rod could barely meet his gaze as the detective stepped into the room. There was no surprise on Harris's face, no judgment, just the cold professionalism of a man who had seen this all before. Rod braced himself, knowing what was coming. "You're not going anywhere, Mr. Covlin," Harris said, his voice flat but firm. Rod didn't respond. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his throat, like stones that he couldn't spit out. The detective slid a piece of paper across the table. Rod didn't need to look at it to know what it was. A charge sheet. The weight of it felt unbearable. Rod's vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. "This is it," Harris said quietly, his eyes piercing. "You're going to be arrested for murder. For framing your daughter. The evidence is clear. There's no escaping this." Rod's body went cold. He felt a sickening emptiness settle in the pit of his stomach, like a weight that would never leave. The detective was right. This was the end. Rod had played his final hand, and now there was no more room for lies or escape. Harris stood, pushing the paper closer. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Covlin?" he asked, his tone neutral but expectant. Rod opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? He had nothing left. No defense. No excuse. His actions had sealed his fate. Rod's eyes drifted to the floor, and a single tear slid down his cheek. For the first time since all of this had begun, he felt the full weight of what he had done. Rod sat in the cold, sterile room, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. His entire world had collapsed in on itself, leaving him a hollow shell of the man he once was. Every thought felt heavy, as if each memory, each mistake, was a weight too large to bear. He had wanted so badly to escape the life that held him back, to claw his way to freedom. But now, all of it felt so meaningless. His wife's life, his daughter's future, his own sanity, it had all crumbled for nothing. Detective Harris stood before him, silent, waiting. Rod could feel the detective's gaze on him, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. The door was open. His fate was sealed. Rod's hands trembled as he lifted them to his face, wiping away the tears that had begun to form. He had killed Sheila. He had stolen her life, and in doing so, he had taken everything from himself. Katie would grow up without her mother. She would grow up without the life she deserved, all because of the twisted choices he had made. His mind was a blur now, memories flashing by in fragments, the image of his daughter's tear-streaked face standing out more than any of the others. I didn't mean for any of this," Rod whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. Harris didn't respond, but his presence was suffocating, and it wasn't about to let Rod escape the truth any longer. The door behind them opened again, and 2 officers entered the room, their footsteps echoing with finality. Rod didn't need to be told. He knew what was coming. His hands shook as they were cuffed behind his back, the cold metal biting into his wrists. Every movement felt slow, like he was wading through thick mud. The officers guided him out of the room, and Rod stumbled slightly, his legs weak beneath him. He was led down the hallway, each step dragging him closer to a future he could no longer control.
Katie.
The thought of her face, the horror of seeing her caught in this nightmare, gnawed at him with every step. Rod wanted to reach out, to apologize to her, to tell her it wasn't supposed to be like this, but the words were trapped. There was no way to fix this. The cold air of the station pressed against his skin as they reached the exit. The reality hit him with full force. There would be no second chances. No redemption. Rod Covlin was going to pay the price for his greed and deceit. And as the door swung open, the blinding daylight hit him, Rod knew that the world outside would never be the same. Neither would he. As Rod was ushered into the back of the police car, the reality of his life, the life he had destroyed, settled in like a heavy fog. The cool metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists, and the tightness in his chest mirrored the emptiness that had taken hold of his soul. Outside, the world seemed oblivious to the storm of guilt and shame that had shattered his existence. People moved through their daily lives, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in the quiet corners of his mind. But for Rod, it was all over. There was no escaping what he had done. The officer slammed the door of the car shut, the sound echoing in the silence that surrounded him. Rod's eyes wandered, but nothing felt real. His body felt detached, as if he were watching his own story unfold from a distance, powerless to stop it. As the car pulled away from the police station, Rod's mind flashed back to the beginning, to the lies he had told, to the manipulation, to the cruel choices that had led him here. He had killed Sheila for the fortune, and in the process, he had destroyed everything that was worth living for. He had sacrificed his dignity, his future, and his daughter's happiness, all for the shallow promise of wealth. But now, as the streets blurred past, all of that seemed so distant, so insignificant. He had nothing left. His wealth, his plans, his life. None of it mattered. It was all in pieces, scattered around him, irreparable. Rod's thoughts drifted to Katie again. The poor, innocent child who had been dragged into this nightmare. What would become of her? Would she ever forgive him? Would she ever feel safe again? He didn't know. And that was the hardest truth of all. The car slowed as it neared the jail, and the world outside grew even darker, more distant. As Rod was led inside, the cold, stark walls of the prison enveloped him, a final reminder that there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. Rod's eyes met those of the officer escorting him. For a brief moment, he saw a flicker of something in the officer's gaze, perhaps pity, perhaps judgment, but it didn't matter. It was too late for that. As the door to his cell clanged shut, sealing him away from the world, Rod finally understood. The price for his greed had been far too high. And as he sank to the cold floor, his face buried in his hands, the weight of his choices crushed him. There was no redemption, only the bitter reality of his own downfall. And in the silence of his cell, Rod was left to face the truth. He had killed his wife, tried to frame his daughter, and destroyed everything in the pursuit of a fleeting fortune. Now, all that remained was the shadow of regret hanging over him for the rest of his days.